Okay, so this should be a little bit kind of shorter and sweeter than yesterday. We're going to do a couple of things to help us cover chapter 5. We're going to link some wider reading into this just because when you're talking about this wider reading, you can talk about how the Grapes of Wrath and Gatsby are different from kind of earlier generations of American writing rather than just looking for similarities as well. So we can just want to be able to make that kind of point as we go through. And then chapter 25 is essentially Steinbeck kind of creating the image of a kind of corrupted Eden. Or Arcadia, or however you want to call it, this kind of idea that California was somewhere kind of idealistic, but Steinbeck is depicting to us something that has been kind of corrupted by mankind. And he does more than this. He shows just how wasteful this process can be. For the sake of profit, we are kind of prepared to completely waste the resources that we have available. So what I think you can kind of do around this one is, again, just think about contemporary examples of this, and I think it'll help you understand exactly what he's showing in the Grapes of Wrath, essentially. Okay, so what are we doing first? Here we are, Walt Whitman. Okay, I would just like to spend a few minutes kind of paused and doing some research into Walt Whitman, and I'll go through a couple of key points afterwards. So just pause me for a minute, have a look at Walt Whitman, and see what you can find out in terms of details around him. Okay, so Walt Whitman is of kind of the generation before kind of Fitzgerald and Steinbeck, essentially. And what you should have found is, he's essentially looking in a more positive way at America, at the kind of countryside, at the kind of the natural side of America. A lot of his poetry shows man kind of at one with nature, and man kind of essentially experiencing nature in a positive way. And indeed, he was kind of criticized for almost overly eroticizing this kind of experience as well. So he is going to provide us with kind of an interesting counterpoint to what you see in chapter 25. So what I want you to do, there's an attachment that's come with the email. Open up the kind of Walt Whitman poetry sample. It comes from his collection Leaves of Grass, which he was kind of redrafting over and over again. And whilst the original version of this was kind of before the time period that yours is set in, the version that I've given you is his republished and redone version that comes kind of within the 1880 to 1940 period. And what I would like you to have a look at here is how Whitman is presenting kind of that experience of nature, how he's kind of putting that across through his poetry, because this can provide a useful point of kind of contrast to the Grapes of Wrath and to Gatsby. So I think you probably want to spend about kind of 10-15 minutes, read through it, then go through and annotate kind of key bits, looking for bits that you might use to show as an example of your wider reading. Okay, so pause me for a bit. Okay, so within the poem here for Whitman, you might point out some of the things like the kind of the sensual aspects to it. He wants to go to the bank of the wood undisguised and naked. There's a sense of wanting to be in direct contact with these kind of natural things. I'm mad for it to be in contact with me. And there are other bits that kind of eroticize it. The smoke of his own breath, the crotch and the vine. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, and as you kind of go down, the sniff of green leaves and the drier leaves from the shore and the dark-coloured sea rocks and the hay of the barn, the sound of the belched words and my voice loosed to the eddies of the wind. So he is kind of presented as part of nature. There's a very sensory kind of experience of nature here, the kind of something tactile, the smells of it, the kind of feeling of it, essentially. Yeah, other bits to point out from that kind of first part of it. Again, the kisses, the embraces associated around this kind of natural image, and simply that kind of delight and wonder that he shows in it. The song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun. The very idea of it's the title of this one, Song of Myself, and it's a song of self being at one with kind of nature here. So Whitman is showing himself, but also kind of mankind. He's creating an ideal in relation to kind of man's positioning within nature and the kind of beauty that can come from it. The second bit that I've kind of given you is interesting here, in that again he shows that whilst there's a beauty and a joy, it's cannot fully understand it necessarily. And a child said, "What is the grass?" Fetching it to me with full hands, how could I answer the child? I do not know any more than he. Where there's a kind of wonder in nature, it's incomprehensible in many ways to Whitman and his kind of mind here. So those kind of questions posed and his inability to fully answer becomes important in this last bit. And he kind of goes on, I guess it must be the flag my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. So that image there, he himself is of the grass, he himself is hopeful, he himself is, it's the flag of his disposition, as a metaphor suggests that the grass, like him, is kind of hopeful and growing. So that growth imagery is kind of put alongside mankind. Hang on. Yeah, so sorry, it goes on, and unlike again the Grapes of Wrath, there's a sense of man at one with God and nature as well. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift, a remembrancer. So he sees the grass as something from God left to us. There's a sense that it's a reminder of God's presence. And again, other things that kind of draw out the difference to the Grapes of Wrath and to Gatsby, he refers to it as kind of a hieroglyphic, so it becomes a signifier, but not necessarily something clear. And as we go into that stanza further down, growing among black folks and amongst white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. So there's a state of kind of equality here. Presented through Whitman, this kind of hope of an equality as well. The grass grows the same for people of all different races and cultures within that image, and that kind of idea of it being a kind of unifier, nature unifying people here. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut header of graves. So even in the kind of more bleak image, it's still beautiful here. Now, this is useful, as I say, you're going to need to talk about kind of wider reading, and we can link this in to kind of the Grapes of Wrath and to Gatsby. So within the Grapes of Wrath, in chapter 25, you get this kind of whole idea of a kind of fall of Eden, essentially. And it presents a kind of interesting point of view here. Now, what I want you guys to do, you're going to use about the first three in fact, you can use a bit more than that. Hang on, let me see exactly where I wanted to go up to. Yeah, the first 5 paragraphs of chapter 25, in fact. And what I want you to do, I want you to be able to talk about the contrast that he creates here between the ideal of California, how it's kind of initially beautiful, and the ways in which mankind has kind of corrupted it. So, and you should be able to kind of link this into the Whitman stuff from before. So where Whitman is kind of creating this image of kind of man, not necessarily understanding nature, but one with nature. Think about how Steinbeck suggests that man's understanding is growing through that kind of scientific means, but that this is in many ways kind of destructive. It's not good for nature here. Okay, now I'd like to spend kind of 10, 15, maybe even up to kind of 20 minutes just analysing those kind of paragraphs, working out exactly where You can pick out the kind of idealistic images and the way that it's broken down, and then I'll go through and pick out some kind of key points that I'd pick out. Okay, so consider those kind of initial images in the first couple of kind of paragraphs here. The fruit blossoms are fragrant pink and white waters in a shallow sea. So he uses kind of imagery of water here. And as you kind of look down on the fruit trees as they're in flower, it appears almost like a sea here. He can as he's looking up on it. And the swelling from the old gnarled vines cascade down and cover the trunks. So again, that cascade is kind of water image. There's a kind of, in that, the drought image of before, back in Oklahoma, we're now getting imagery associated with water and this kind of fruitfulness. And the green trees themselves are kind of round and soft as breasts. So again, that image of kind of the maternal, of growth, of kind of development here. And they carpet the earth with pink and white. You get the cherries and apples, peaches and pears and figs that close the flower and the fruit. So he's kind of extending this image of fruitfulness. You get these big long lists of the kind of the bounty of nature here, essentially. And this then contrasts with what follows in terms of how mankind has pushed this too far. Okay, so the first thing to note is that he focuses in on the scientific angle here. It's kind of science that is changing nature, and the argument here from Steinbeck is essentially that it's pushing it too far. It's doing too much, and where he's kind of putting down behind the fruitfulness of men of understanding and knowledge and skill. And these men work carefully, endlessly to perfect the seed, the roots, the men of chemistry, doctors of preventative medicine. There's actually a kind of sense of irony to this, because yes, these are kind of clever individuals. He doesn't deny that, but he sees their work as being kind of corruptive. So he talks later on in that kind of third paragraph, for theirs is the surgeon's job, as tender and delicate, and these men must have surgeon's hands and surgeon's hearts to slit the bark. And the image of the surgeon is important because it's something kind of medicalized, scientific, but it's also something you've got to have kind of a cold heart to be able to cut into something, to cut into a living body, to change it in a sense. And he shows as he kind of goes through that this is becoming something almost too much. The limbs now kind of sag down against the crutches under their weight. The trees can barely hold up their own weight. They're being pushed too far. And the year is heavy with produce, and the men are proud, for their knowledge can make the year heavy. So yes, we've changed things and the men are proud, but again, he's creating an irony here, because what should be beautiful nature has been turned into simply produce. That's all the concern is about, the production of something, and these natural images are becoming corrupted through that. And you get the kind of last bit, and always they work, selecting, grafting, changing, driving themselves, driving the earth to produce. So there's this state of kind of constantly pushing it further and further and further. And Steinbeck sees this as kind of unsustainable. So his point here, the idea that he's trying to put across, is that we've kind of, our understanding has developed and we're now corrupting nature. We are commodifying nature. We're pushing it too far. So unlike Whitman, he's showing man not at one with nature, but man manipulating and corrupting and changing nature into something unnatural. There's no experience of it in the same way. Now, the chapter then kind of develops, and I think it's useful to kind of, again, see the contemporary example. I know you can't click on this link here now, but if you just do a kind of Google search for kind of Burberry Burns stock, you'll see a kind of contemporary example of what Steinbeck is showing here, where for the sake of kind of prices, reputation, for kind of profits, essentially above everything else. A lot of kind of big companies and institutions are willing to simply waste their produce as well, because they're so focused on the profits that can be made. And essentially, he's showing that here in the rest of the chapter. So Burberry, essentially to preserve their brand profile, will burn any leftover, any unsold stock, rather than kind of give it away to people who may be in need, can't afford clothes themselves. They would rather burn it than see those people wearing it, because it will hit their profits if they don't. So you get this huge wasteful process, and it's not just Burberry, it's a lot of the kind of fashion brands, and you see this all over. Now, what I want you to do, I want you to kind of have a look at that. So have a quick research around it, then read the rest of the chapter, and you're aiming to kind of point out where there are kind of similarities to this that are developed through the rest of the chapter, where the companies are more concerned with kind of profits and what they can make from this, and that waste comes at the expense of kind of the lives of others, that they would rather kind of completely waste things than give it away to those people who are starving, because that would mean that their commodity loses its state of value. Okay, so I would say have a research around on that, looking in then in the chapter, so probably about 15-20 minutes to kind of draw out your key points that would allow you to kind of discuss around this. Okay, so within this, essentially he's kind of looking at the plight of the kind of poorer farmers initially, and how big business is kind of taking them over as well. Now, just like with the handbills, he's sort of depicting a system whereby there's so much produce that's been created that essentially the supply outstrips the demand, and because of that, it becomes unprofitable to even bother picking them. But the problem with this is you've also got a load of starving people, but if you just give them to the starving people, you lose even more of the profit. Where's the point in it at all? You need to create a system whereby things are produced essentially. And he kind of slates this system essentially. So we get various bits like, so I was like, hell, we can't pick them from out. My God, we can't pick them. So you get this kind of repeated image of the kind of desperate people unable to even pick the crops because it's simply not profitable enough. And then you get the kind of images of rot and decay coming into it. And first the skins wrinkle a little, and a swarm of flies come to feast, and the valley is filled with the odour of sweet decay. The meat turns dark, and the crop shrivels on the ground. And it kind of continues this kind of idea. And the yellow fruit falls heavily on the ground and splashes on the ground. So because a profit can't be made, we get this kind of repeated image of, waste coming into it, of food simply rotting. And we've seen throughout the narrative that lots of kind of these starving figures, even within the Joad family, we've got kind of starving children. And it goes on into the wine as well. They're no longer producing good wine because it's not profitable. They're simply kind of chemicalizing the wine. It starts to talk about this poisoning the air, and this metaphor is kind of continued, this smell of rot and decay, and it becomes more than simply the smell of the wine. This whole system smells of rot and decay. It's a kind of broken system essentially. And he points out only the great owners can survive, for they own the canneries too. So only those who've kind of created a monopoly from the whole system are able to make a profit. Only the really big companies. Again, you're kind of cutting out people's ability and ownership over the land is what kind of Steinbeck is suggesting, and this is intensely kind of destructive. and a couple of other bits to kind of point out. Men who can graft the trees and make the seed fertile and big can find no way to let the hungry people eat their produce. Men who have created new fruits in the world cannot create a system whereby their fruits can be eaten. So those people who he's described as kind of clever, as intelligent, have actually not improved the world. He's kind of suggested they've only made it worse. They have created a system whereby the people who are starving, the people who need the food most, can no longer have the food. And then as the chapter progresses, he creates these increasingly kind of disturbing images of the lengths that these companies, these people will go to in order to preserve their profits. So Steinbeck kind of heightens this as we go through. Kerosene sprayed on the Golden Mountain, so they're burning the orange crop, they're spraying fuel onto it and burning it. They dump potatoes in the rivers and place guards along the banks to keep the hungry people from fishing them out. So again, it comes back to this idea within the Grapes of Wrath of kind of profit coming before all else, before any kind of human compassion, and they will literally starve people to death in order to maintain that profit. They will guard the rotting fruit to stop people from eating it. And Steinbeck kind of heightens this, and the smell of rot fills the country. It's not just the rot of the food, it's the kind of moral rot is his implication. And he talks about there being a crime here that goes beyond denunciation, that this is, in Steinbeck's view, a kind of criminal activity here, essentially, that this is something kind of deeply disturbing for Steinbeck. Right, okay. What I'm going to kind of set for you, rather than kind of do it as a sheet, it's just on the PowerPoint. This is just for chapter 26. Chapter 26 is quite a long chapter, so it'll be the chapter that we kind of focus on next time. It'll be after Easter now. But I want you to go over chapter 26, do the pre-reading, look at it, and there is the kind of pre-reading advice. So the leaving of the camp, how Mara is kind of central to that, how the entrance to the farm that they go to work on is depicted, and the way that the work is depicted itself, the storekeeper incident, and then Casey's death is going to be a huge point that we're going to kind of focus on, because it's one of the kind of significant turning points of the novel. Okay, so be working on that pre-reading as well. But that's as much as we're going to go through today. We've covered those 3 chapters.